My name is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. We're thrilled to have you here with us. We have been doing these two-a-week events for the past month plus now, and have had a great time talking to all kinds of people, fiction, nonfiction, all over the map, people from all over the country, some outside the country, and we're going to keep that going. The plan is to keep these virtual events going on Monday nights and Thursday nights, at least through July, and then we'll kind of see where that is. And then I would imagine even as we start working physical in-person events back into the calendar, we'll probably be weaving in some virtuals here and there. Next week, we have two great ones. We have on Monday, we're going to be talking to the writer Stephanie Danler. Her last book, Sweet Bitter, was a big success, kind of an inside look at the restaurant industry from a novelist perspective. Her new book, though, is a memoir called Stray, which is pretty harrowing and basically about her having to raise herself, having two addict parents in California. It's a tough read, but it's a really powerful read. And if you're a fan of things like The Liars Club or any books like that, you'll really dig this book. It's going to be Monday night. And then Thursday night, we're going to be talking to scientist Neil Shubin, who's written a book called Some Assembly Required. So that's, for you science geeks and nerds out there, it should be a really fascinating talk. And then we have stuff, like I said, all the way booked through July, including we just booked a virtual chat for July 6th with Colson Whitehead. That'll be fascinating. And so a lot of people coming up. So stay tuned. You can check the website for that. Free and open to the public most of the time. We might occasionally charge for one, but we'll let you know ahead of time if we do that. And then what else? The store is reopening on Monday, June 1st. So we're going to be opening the store up on June 1st with some restrictions in place in terms of how many people can be in there. And of course, we encourage you guys to wear masks and use social distancing, but we're excited to get that going. And then next weekend, that first weekend of us being open, we're so thrilled and lucky to have the Poet Laureate of the United States, Joy Harjo, in Tulsa, and working above our bookstore as a Tulsa Artist Fellow. She reached out to us and asked if we would be willing to sell her personal library for her as a fundraiser for our local food bank. So next weekend or weekend after this, on the 5th and 6th, we're going to have a kind of a sidewalk sale outside the store and be selling Joy Harjo's personal library, and all the money from that will be supporting the Community Food Bank of Eastern Oklahoma, and some of it will go back to the Tulsa Literary Coalition as well. But pretty cool. She's writing a little note to the reader for each book and all kinds of stuff. So pretty special opportunity there. So let's get to the task at hand. I'm so excited to talk to my buddy, Elliot Ackerman. We've had the chance to have quite a few events in Tulsa and get to know each other. I was sad to see we weren't able to do this one in person for Red Dress and Black and White, but I'm glad we were able to at least figure out a way to contact each other through the internet, the magic of the internet. If you guys haven't had a chance to get the book yet, it's brand new. We're going to be having, there it is.
There you go.
Product placement. Thank you for that. We will be having links in the comment section here where you can buy the book directly from us. We'll post that a few times as we go. And let's give a big welcome to Elliot Ackerman. Hey, Elliot.
Hey, Jeff. It's great to almost be with you. I'm sad to be missing my trip to Tulsa too, but maybe next time.
I know it's become kind of an annual thing,
Yeah, it's a pilgrimage, and I enjoy it.
So I guess I'd like to begin. I was thinking about this today. I was thinking, you've written 4 novels and a work of nonfiction in almost as many years. I mean, what kind of run are you on here? This is like Michael Jordan, The Last Dance kind of run you're on here.
That's very generous of you, particularly as I just watched The Last Dance. That's good stuff. I think the publishing, that's, the publishing schedule, that's about right. But as the books don't just take a year. When they get published is very much a different schedule as when they are necessarily written. Like Red Dress and Black and White, I started writing that book probably in 2015. So, we're here 5 years later and it's being published. So there's sort of a long kind of gestation period. And then, and the publishing kind of schedule is what it is. So, yeah.
I think I forgot to say that 2 of the 4 novels have been finalists for the National Book Award, I believe. Is that correct?
Dark at the Crossing was, and then some like the Andrew Carnegie
Yeah,
Prize.
Andrew Carnegie Mellon.
Yeah.
So, not too shabby. But so when you're working on a book like this and you're expecting it to come out into a different world, what's it been like kind of trying to promote a book without being able to really go out and promote the book? I mean, you've said you've done a bunch of these Zoom things, but are you kind of making a strange transition? Because you had a pretty robust touring schedule for the last few books.
We were kind of talking about before. I think there's pros and cons. I mean, listen, I'm like sort of naturally like a half glass full type of person. So I think one of like the pros is I'm talking about the book in venues that I wouldn't otherwise be talking about it, and probably reaching people I might not otherwise be able to reach, and getting to have conversations about the book that if I were doing, what prior book tours would look like, I wouldn't have. Like, for instance, I did an event recently with a Turkish friend of mine, who I was very close friends with when we lived in Istanbul. And I would not have thought of being able to include him in a US-based book event were it not for the current crisis. So, I think, like you were saying in the intro, I think aspects of this are going to stick around because it's nice. You can bring in all sorts of, writers from the far corners of the earth to discuss books, and kind of makes you feel like you're in a larger and broader conversation. But I mean, don't get me wrong, it'll be nice to be like back doing a book event and like properly signing books and talking and meeting with people.
I was thinking, we were talking about, the kind of publishing schedule and how the books have kind of come out. And what's interesting is I was thinking, you've kind of got a nice little shelf. You're starting to have what's called an oeuvre, right? You've got some work out there. And I was wondering if you're starting to see some connections between the books, because I was kind of thinking of them as a body of work and kind of what you've done so far. And I feel like they very much kind of feel of a piece. Each one obviously is a different story, and it's not just you being the author of them all, if that's the obvious connection, but do you see kind of this Elliot Ackerman extended universe that kind of exists throughout the work so far?
I don't plan it per se, but I feel like there's certainly themes that I'm interested in writing about, and they appear in the books in different forms. So like Red Dress in Black and White is basically, it's the story of a woman, Catherine, who's an American woman living in Istanbul, and she's married to a Turkish man, a wealthy real estate developer named Murat. And she, though, is in an unhappy marriage, and she started having an affair with a photographer who's also an American living there. And over the course of one day, she tries to take her son and flee Istanbul from her husband, Murat, with her photographer lover. And the story is basically told with the present action happening over this day, but it's told with these sort of the chapters toggle into the past tense. And you see a lot of the political life inside Turkey over the past 5 years, anchored most substantially in the 2013 Gezi Park protests, which for Americans who aren't necessarily familiar with that series of protests, it was sort of like Turkey's response to the Arab Spring. And it was probably the most profound, not only political event, but cultural event that has happened in Turkey, in a generation. And, hundreds of thousands of protesters came out to Gezi Park in Istanbul to protest the regime, and it led to nationwide protests. So you see this toggling kind of between Catherine and Murat's personal life as she is fleeing with these much larger political themes. And there's this sort of relationship between the political and the personal that exists in Red Dress in Black and White. And I would say, yeah, that probably exists in all of my books, this sort of toggling between like intimate relationships and how they're happening in larger political contexts.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, I guess if I had to describe it kind of the spices that make up the recipe for all these books, it's kind of this grand picture, this sweeping. There's kind of a sweep to them, not unlike like a Graham Greene or like Paul Bowles or some of these people who kind of write some of these larger canvas things. Obviously, there's kind of real pointed stories at the center of these, but it seems like you like to paint on a big canvas. Is that something that you've been interested in even as a reader from a young age?
It is, and all the writers you're mentioning are writers I admired and have read, um, and I think that's certainly the case. And I think particularly in this book, one of the things I was very cognizant of was again, I lived in Turkey for a number of years in Istanbul, and I really wanted the city to feel like a character in the book. Like I wanted the reader to have the same emotional attachment they would have in this book to a character that they loved, and to have that same type of emotional attachment to the city itself, because the city is definitely a force in the story. So I think yes, in all the books, I'm trying to kind of at least give a real sense of place.
It's interesting when you think about the great books that take place in a day and at a certain very specific place. Obviously, Ulysses is one that comes to mind in terms of evoking a place and kind of this one packed day. Talk about Istanbul for those. I would assume most people watching tonight have not been there. What is it like? You kind of give us a sense of that as a place for those of us who may not have been there before.
Yeah, it's one of the great world cities. And I say world cities, I think there are, a handful of cities that exist on this planet that don't necessarily exist within the context of one country or one people's. Like they're sort of owned by all of us. I think Rome's a city like that. Paris is a city like that. London, probably New York City in the US is the closest we have to our own world city. Like in Istanbul, and Istanbul is a Turkish city now, but it wasn't always a Turkish city. It was an Ottoman city. It was a Roman city. It was a Christian city. So you have all these layers in the book. And I wanted that layering of the city to also kind of play out in the story itself. And, and the story has many layers. And I think this book, more than my other books, is kind of, it's one part, I think, political thriller. I think it's, one part love story, although with many deeply flawed characters in this love story, and one part sort of spy novel. So I wanted all of those layers to sort of be acting on top of one another in much the same way you feel like the city has these layers that kind of stretch all the way back through time up to, very immediate contemporary political events.
No, it's very true. I've not been there before, but you do a great job of kind of making me almost kind of smell it, hear it, feel it. And that's not an easy thing to do with words on a page. So that was really an enjoyable part of the book. What I didn't mention this in your intro because I feel like it probably precedes everything you do, but you did have a quite robust career in the U.S. military. You served 5 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I wonder, I'm kind of jumping off track a little bit, but I'm curious, in the moment that we're living in right now, in this quarantine life and kind of the post or present COVID-19 era, did going through that life for so long, the kind of regimented structure of that, prepare you in any way to handle this situation better than the average person, do you think?
I don't want to say better per se, but it certainly has given me a different perspective. I recently wrote an opinion piece about this, and I was sort of in the piece I was reflecting as we've gone through COVID, and I'm in Delaware right now at my wife's house where she grew up, and in the piece I write about this, but she teases me sometimes and she calls me Sobchak. And for those of you who don't get the reference right away, that's to the character, John Goodman's character in The Big Lebowski, Walter Sobchak, who is this sort of Vietnam veteran who everything in life is Vietnam. No matter what he's doing, it reminds him of Vietnam. And she started calling me that because particularly during COVID, anytime we would do something let's say we were getting, we're going to go to the grocery store and we're counting out our gloves and getting our masks ready. And, this sort of reminds me of deployment, we're getting all our gear ready and we're going outside the wire, even though we're just going out our front door. There's a threat out there we have to be prepared for. And so I kept seeing those patterns. And, one of those patterns is just the isolation, that you are in a restricted space with the same people doing what, with probably at this point, some type of established routine. I mean, I certainly have my routines each day. And so psychologically, I do feel like there's a familiarity to it. I'm I know this life rhythm. I've done this life rhythm before. And I think maybe what's helpful is And I'm in my mind like, and I know that I can do it, and I can do it for a long time. This isn't a big deal. I've run this race once before in terms of the rhythm of it. So that I think has made it easier. I don't know if it means that I'm handling it better. If my wife has called me Walter Sobchak, maybe I'm driving her nuts. But it's
Well, yeah, because I was wondering, if it's like, if the basic dichotomy of like, here's a mission or we have an enemy and our job is to figure out how to defeat this thing. That basic worldview comes into play at this point. Like, okay, we know what we need to do. We need to get a vaccine. We need to, whatever the end result is, and that gives some purpose. Because I think some people right now, of course, feel very adrift and kind of don't understand how to kind of function in this place. But then I think all of us have moments where maybe there's a day of good news where something happens, like, they'll say, okay, well, hey, the human trials of a vaccine are going well. And then we go, okay. It starts to feel like we have the vision gets narrowed enough to where we can start to see something here. When you're in the military, does that focus become a skill of sorts?
I think it does. I think, they're in the military, I would say when you're deployed to a war zone, the mission, winning the war, is something that seems probably as obscure to you, as obscure as, achieving the vaccine is to all of us. Like they're similarly obscure. What I would say, and where I do see parallels kind of on a grander sense is, it's kind of like when you go through a really bad breakup, you sort of realize who your real friends are, right? Like that's probably something people have been through. It kind of focuses in like, who are the people with me for me, and like, what was the real social dynamic here? And I would say when you go through a crisis, it really accelerates your sense of community, and you quickly find out like, who's your community? Like who are your people that you're walking through the world with? And I actually think that's like, it's a good thing. Like we're talking about like these book events, these virtual events, like, it's great to see you tonight, Jeff. Like I'm excited and totally stoked to see you. I'd be excited to see you in Tulsa too. But like, this is in some ways more memorable. Like maybe we'll do other book events. Like we're always going to do this one during coronavirus. And I feel like that, and it's a good thing. And when we get to the other side of this, we're all going to have that. And, I look back at some of my war buddies, guys I'm in touch with today, I text with today. There are guys I'll know on my deathbed. I'm sure of that. But when you look at the amount of time we actually spent together, seeing each other every day, it's 9 months, it was a year, and it was 9 months in a year at this point, coming up on 15, 20 years ago. So again, I think the war brings those interpersonal relationships kind of really into focus, and it accelerates a sense of community. And I definitely see that sort of in some places, that like accelerated sense of community happening right now. I mean, it's happening in a horrible pandemic. I'm not saying any of that to diminish, the crisis that's going on, but that is something that we can take away from it. And I think it will be a force for good.
It is a strange moment and a feeling that comes on occasionally for me. And it happens times in our lives, I think, where you pause and realize you're living in a moment that is truly historic, right? Now, this is a horrible one, and we're losing so many people. But, you think about this, and, I think for people of, my generation, your generation, our grandparents had a few of those kind of red letter moments in their lives, right? And they were bad. The Great Depression was bad, obviously World War II, all these different things, and those kind of defined how we thought about those people a little bit. Those were kind of those moments. And you do wonder how that will play out with this, like 50 years from now, 30 years from now, whatever, are we going to be kind of looking at this moment as something on maybe not that quite scale as it was World War II, but something on that same shelf of kind of experiences?
I think it's certainly going to bookend, where we are. Like, I think we can officially say that the post 9/11 moment is over. There's now a new bookend. I mean, maybe it was post 9/11 or 9/11, financial crisis, everything that kind of came after. But this, I think, draws a line in the sand, and there will be everything that was before this and everything that was after this. And it's, for me, I mean, I have children, so it's interesting to see it through their eyes too, and to see how they're kind of processing it, and to know that it's going to be something they always, always remember, like the homeschooling and stuff like that.
You mentioned the opinion piece that you wrote. I'm curious, I've talked to so many writers over the last couple of months, and they're all kind of dealing with this quarantine life very differently. Some are writing more than ever, some are kind of totally blocked in a way. Are you, still consistently writing a lot outside of stuff about the situation we're living in?
I am. This I'm. I am. I like going out. I like being out in the world. I like writing about the world, and that inspires most of my books. But I am also a creature of habit, and my writing habits are kind of they anchor me every day. And so I kind of, I had the things I was working on before this, and I've sort of continued working on those projects through this, and and that's sort of how I find my sanity each day.
I want to remind folks, if you haven't gotten a chance to get this book, there's a couple of links in the comments there. You can buy that directly from us. Yep, product placement right there. Red dress in black and white. Beautiful cover, by the way. You must be thrilled with that cover.
They always do a beautiful job. I love this cover.
Yeah, it's a great one. And also, if you have some questions, I'll incorporate those as we go. So feel free to drop your questions in here. What about reading? Have you been reading a lot over the last couple of months? More than usual? And
has it been more than usual? But yeah, certainly. I'm reading. I don't think what I read. I'm reading right now. I have my current book. Richard Yates.
Oh yeah.
This is great. He's one of my favorites. This is one of his few that I haven't read. I just think he's a absolutely beautiful writer. I recently read Rob Doyle's book, Threshold, which is a great book. I don't know if you saw that one.
There's a wonderful biography of Richard Yates. Have you read that? It's by Blake Bailey.
I've never read it.
Yeah, it's one of the great literary biographies.
Okay.
Very sad, of course, but very good. And so, talk about the process for writing this book, right? When you spend so much time in Istanbul, right? So you know this place. When's the last time you were there, actually? I'm curious.
About a year plus ago.
So you said you started the book 5 years ago. Obviously, were you still in the process of doing it? And was that part of going back? Were you still working on the book when you went back?
This book bridged my time in Istanbul. So I was working on this book as I left. And one of the things that's actually surprised me was I found it easier to write about the city when I wasn't in the city. Maybe that's not surprising, but because I think you sort of, when it's not right in your face and you're being forced to conjure it in your imagination, sometimes it's easier to get it down onto the page. So in the drafts that I was working on when I was outside of Istanbul and back in New York, those were the drafts I feel like the most progress was made in kind of trying to like breathe life into the city. So the books, I started writing the book while I was there, but it was a bridge as I came back to the US.
Do you consider yourself a good, honest judge of your work? Meaning, like, are you able to say, this is the best work you've done? Do you see a progression of your quality or style as each work happens? I know you said they're kind of happening at different times. Obviously, the publication schedule doesn't necessarily line up with when they're writing, but can you see yourself, evolving as a writer?
That's a tough question, Jeff.
They're not all going to be easy. Sorry.
I don't know if I'm a good, honest judge of my work. I hope that I am, but in every project I work on, I know I get it as far as I can possibly get it on my own. And I put it away for a long time. I reread it. I read it on the computer, or I print it out and read it. I read it out loud to myself. I'm doing all of those things as I'm working on a book, because those are all ways for me to kind of look at it from a different angle. If I'm hearing it, I'm approaching it in a different way than if I'm reading it. And if I'm reading it on a computer screen, I'm reading it in a different way than if I'm reading it printed out with a number 2 pencil. I just always find that every time I kind of read it in a different way, I catch things that I don't otherwise catch. So I don't know if that makes me a good judge of my work per se, but that's sort of like the kind of the yeoman's work I'm doing. But in terms of like a progression of books, I don't know if they're progressing on like a linear, line like this, but they're progressing in that my interests, evolve and shift and change, and my work is shifting around those interests. And I'm definitely conscious of that.
We have a question which is about, you mentioned having done a virtual event with a friend that you have in Turkey. Have you had any response from people in Turkey to your vision of what Istanbul is? Any feedback from the Turks?
The thing that's interested me is that I've had a little bit of feedback. From friends, but I kind of don't count it because they're my friends. They'll always, put your arm around you, tell you that they love you. But I've had emails from in the last just few days from Turks who've seen the publication in U.S. media, who are interested in the book, and just interested that someone is writing about Gezi Park. The book is very much from an expatriate sort of perspective, not directly a Turkish perspective. So, I'll be interested to see, what a Turkish audience thinks about the book. But I know that, that event is totally profound for Turkish society, and it continues to have, rippling effects there.
Do you have any sense of whether the book will eventually be translated there or not?
I have a Turkish publisher, so they're doing Dark at the Crossing at the moment. So yeah, hopefully in a little time it'll get translated and published.
When you're writing a book, anything really, who do you think your audience is? I'm curious. Do you feel like, because I would imagine for the last book, the book of nonfiction that you did, obviously you probably had a lot of people who maybe had coming out to events and things that had a past in the military or in the service and wanted to kind of have some camaraderie there. But in terms of the fiction, do you see, when you go out and kind of meet your readers, who are they? Who are these people? And kind of, do you have a person in mind that you're writing to? I mean, some people say, I write for myself, I don't really think about the audience, but do you think at all about kind of the reader and what role they play in your work?
Honestly, I try more than anything to write the types of books that I enjoy reading. And so I'm not specifically thinking about one reader for the book. More than I'm just trying to, I'm trying to write a clean, like a very clean, honest story, that will frankly just, keep people like hopefully turning pages and, if they're reading with a pen, underlining the things that they like. Because the books that I enjoy, you look at this, like, the book I'm reading right now, the Richard Yates book, I mean, it's like, it's underlined, it's dog-eared, like that, those are the types of books I like to read. And so that is always my ambition, is to try to, produce that type of a book, and one that frankly, I mean, like makes people feel something, that elicits that type of reaction from somebody.
I was talking earlier about kind of, one of my favorite things about your work is the kind of general sweep and scope of the narrative. And it really does kind of lend itself to kind of the cinematic view. I'm curious if any of the books have been optioned, or you have any thoughts about the books ever being adapted for TV or for film.
I mean, sure, like that's always great. Dark of the Crossing made it pretty far along, but that deal sort of fizzled out in the end. I don't know, we're early days, so if anyone is in the audience, give me a call.
Yeah. What do you think? Well, let me rephrase that. The romance at the center of the book is fairly important. And you do a great job of, I don't know how to say this without saying it. It's not cheesy, I guess is my point. It's very real. It does not feel melodramatic, but it is dramatic, and it has the kind of feeling of a real relationship. Can you kind of talk about how to find the balance and tone? I mean, tone is such an important thing with not just this book, but all your work. But finding that line between, you want this, like I said, this sweep and scope and the drama and the tension and all that, but it can, in the wrong hands, tip over into melodrama and into kind of a different place. Is that something, when you said you're reading your own work, that you're kind of always trying to find that perfect tone?
In this book more than any other, that was a real challenge, because I wanted to write, and one of the ambitions I had with this book going into it, and one of the things I knew it was about thematically from the outset, was that it was a book about the hidden architectures in a group of people's lives. It was about the hidden architectures in a society, and how this group of people, Catherine, Marat, Peter, Kristen, who's one of the individuals at the consulate, how they're all linked together. And you see that over the course of the book, and how in many ways, the immediacies of their lives, the practicalities of their lives are what keep them not only involved in the relationships that they're in, but keep them in Istanbul. So it was, and I think that's true. I think, we live our lives, and, there's parts of our lives we love, and there are parts of our lives that aren't perfect. And we tolerate the imperfections. And sometimes we have to be pragmatic about the way that we're living. And so I say that because the book is a love story, but the characters are not sentimental, and the romance or love in some cases they have for one another isn't always sentimental. So it was this struggle of, how do you tell a non-sentimental love story, but also have the readers identifying with the characters. And so the book very much, in my opinion, steers away from melodrama, and it does that sort of in the service of trying to be honest about the lives that we live and the limitations that exist with the relationships that we have frequently.
Yeah, sentimentality is a good way to put it. I think that was the word I was looking for, in the sense of, you want people to feel something, and they do, right? And sometimes the easiest grasp to make people feel something is to go toward the sentimental. It's much harder to find that place without doing that.
Right, but you want them to feel something real. You don't want them to feel something that's like cheap at the end.
Right, exactly. Not a sugar high. You want something a little more nutritious. Are Catherine or Marat based on real people? I'm sure you probably hate this question, but I'm wondering, they're so specific and they're so well drawn. I wonder if there's any basis in reality with those characters.
They're not based on, listen, by the time I'm finished writing the book, I will say, and this is for all my books, none of them are based on real people. They're not real people. They're works of my imagination. They are amalgamations of people I've met. I sort of know where the little hidden bits are that are from real life, because obviously those exist in the book. One thing I will say, and it's something I've done, and I do in a lot of my books, and sometimes people like kind of gasp when I say this, but oftentimes when I start a book, I will name characters after people that I know, like very intentionally. Don't worry about this if you're friends with me, because the names always change, but it will basically be because early on in the writing process, I really need to feel like close to a character. Like I can like wrap my arms around them and hold them so they don't sort of, flitter off into the ether. And then inevitably those characters, like as I'm writing them and they're developing, they become completely their own people, and they always wind up shedding. In 90% of the cases, they wind up shedding that original name. I've had a couple times where that original name just always worked, and it stuck, and they became a different version of the person who has that name in my life. But usually the name changes. But I will say, of those 10% who do stick with the original name, there is one person in this book who started out as someone I knew in life and who kept their name the whole way through.
It's like when they, will auction off a walk-on part in a movie or something like that. They won the contest in some way.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense of what is coming next for you?
I have.
Are you going to toggle back and forth as you go between fiction and nonfiction, or was the last book kind of a book you felt like you had to write? I mean, the book, the work of nonfiction that came out, was it last year and a half ago, whenever it was, felt like a book that you had to kind of deliver. I wondered though if you were kind of going to have this Norman Mailer-esque career where you're toggling back and forth between fiction, nonfiction, because that's kind of a career you don't see as much. It kind of used to happen a lot.
It did used to happen. It used to happen a lot more, and it doesn't happen as much anymore. So yeah, I plan on continuing to write nonfiction. I don't have a book in mind right now, but I do write and continue to write lots of journalism. I'm doing lots of. I have a opinion piece that runs every twice a month right now over at the Times, and so that's been keeping me busy in terms of the nonfiction. In terms of book projects, I have another novel that's going to come out with Knopf called Bloomfield, which we're still in the very early stages of. That's the working title right now, and it's set in London, and it really kind of centers around the 2016 London bridge attacks, if you remember those. So that's sort of kind of the central political aspect or piece of it. And then I actually have a book coming out next year that's sort of a departure for me. It's a book that I have co-written with a retired Navy admiral, a guy named Jim Stavridis, who used to be the admiral in charge of NATO. And it's sort of a thought experiment. It's a work of speculative fiction about what it would look like if the U.S. and China went to war in the year 2034. And it is appropriately titled 2034. So that's what's sort of coming down the pike. But then, I have I guess I call them like my top secret projects, the things that I'm, trying to breathe life into right now.
So one of the soapboxes I've been on recently, and I get into this conversation, I probably had this conversation 5 times in the last 2 weeks with people, is I'm really kind of getting burnt out on book classification because I really feel like it hurts readership a lot.
It does.
And you bringing up that speculative fiction book makes me really think about this, because speculative fiction, of course, is how we sometimes refer to what used to be called science fiction. Now we kind of bifurcated that a little bit. And it is different, but in some ways people use that term differently. But your books, for example, there's such the spy component of this book. I mean, it's a pot boiler in a lot of ways, but it's very much presented as a kind of literary novel, right? And I sometimes worry that those two words scare people off a little bit. And because sometimes like a good read is a good read. I don't really care if it's literary genre, whatever. If it's good, I'm interested. If it's not good, I'm not interested. And it seems like more and more we kind of are putting things into little silos more and more. And I worry that that's limiting ourselves. Do you ever think about those kind of things?
I do all the time. And I think about it outside the context of books. I think in many cases where, listen, we all know this, our society is like increasingly balkanized, the way we consume media and the way we consume culture. So I think, we see that in some degrees with books and the over genreification of books. But I think we see it across the board. So again, I kind of go back to like my North Stars. Like I'm trying to write the types of books that I enjoy reading. And if I can do that, then I feel like I'm doing my job.
Yeah. Well, I want to see, let's see, one more little commercial. If you guys haven't had a chance to get Red Dress in Black and White, there's a link on the side there. Please do that. If you don't realize this, Magic City Books is owned and operated by the Tulsa Literary Coalition, nonprofit organization. When you buy a book from us, you're supporting what we do. You're also supporting great authors like Elliot Ackerman. So do that today. And if you've already read it, it's a great gift, and you can even read it more than once. And I believe we also have plenty of backlist available as well. So I'd like to just kind of finish with, you mentioned earlier in our talk, you're a glass half full kind of guy, right?
I try to be.
Yeah, I mean, kind of, and you also talked about speculative fiction. Where are we going to be a year from now when the next book comes out? You said you have another book coming out. Do you have any sense of where we'll be as a society a year from now? Do you feel optimistic long-term? I'm like a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist.
Um, I don't think it does any good being pessimistic. So I think we'll be back. I think we'll be back to work, and I'll be, I'll be at Magic City, seeing you, and we'll be going out to get barbecue afterwards.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. That sounds great to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this has been fun. I want to say, everybody, like I said, get a copy of Red Dress in Black and White. You're going to love it. It's a great distraction from the moment we're in. We can't really get on, well, we can get on planes, but we're probably not getting on planes. You're probably not planning your trip to Istanbul, but you can go there without having to do that by reading this book. And if you haven't had a chance to read Elliot's previous works, take the deep dive. We're at a good point now where he's not 20 books deep. You can read the full body of work in a month and a half tops. You can do this. And you'll have a great time. So do that. Stay safe. I want to say a big thank you to Elliot for joining us. I hope to see you next year here in town for the next thing. And take care, everybody. Take care of yourself. Stay safe. We'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and thanks everybody for coming out.
All right, take care of yourself. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight. We will see you all again real soon. Like Jeff mentioned, store reopens to the public June 1, and so we look forward to having you come down and see us sometime next week if you're getting out and about. If you're not, we'll continue to ship books to you, and like he said, Elliot's is a great place to start. Those books are all available. If you didn't want to break away during the event tonight, you can always just go to the Magic City Books homepage and be able to click through to the virtual author store that we have there on the homepage. So thanks again for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you again at another virtual event in the weeks to come, and hopefully seeing you at the store very soon. Have a good night. Good night, Elliot.
Night.